my name is Pete from morethanwords.be and I'm an Adobe Lightroom certified expert, and in this video I want to talk to you about the new features of Lightroom Classic CC. And the first new feature I want to talk to you about is actually that name change. So what's happened is that the applications formerly known as Lightroom 6 and Lightroom CC 2015, the subscription version of Lightroom, have now been rebranded into Lightroom Classic CC. And this, of course, entails two questions. What has happened to Lightroom CC as we knew it, and what's happening to Lightroom 6? Well, let me address those in order. So first thing, Lightroom CC, so the application that you used to know as Lightroom, is now the name of a completely new application, and I'll quickly show it to you. And this is an application that under the hood shares the same raw processing engine as Lightroom, but it's completely focused towards the cloud. So with Lightroom CC, which will be a separate subscription, by the way, if you're interested, and I can imagine people either sticking to Lightroom Classic or switching to Lightroom CC, but for the moment, I wouldn't really recommend you use both because, well, it's a double subscription for one, and also there's a couple of things you need to know about if you use both, how they interact, but that's a different video altogether. I just wanted to give you a quick sneak peek of Lightroom CC. Let's go into single image mode here, and on the right here you have all the develop parameters that you know from the Lightroom Classic, as it's now called. And it's all the same. So if you edit an image in Lightroom Classic, Lightroom CC will read those edits. That's not a problem. But you see the controls have been slightly reorganized in a more organic way. Now, Lightroom CC 1.0, as it's fully called right now, does lack a couple of features that Lightroom Classic has. For example, there is, as of now, no split toning, there is no tone curve, but again, it does read images that were edited in Lightroom Classic and that do have split toning or tone curve applied to it. It's just not able to introduce them, these features, in through Lightroom CC as of yet, but I'm sure that will change pretty quickly. Now, the main difference, and that's all I want to say about Lightroom CC right now, is that Lightroom CC is completely cloud-based. So you download and you install the app on your computer or more than one computers, but your files themselves in Lightroom Classic, they are stored locally on internal, external hard drives, or they are stored on a network drive, but it's still on a physical drive. With Lightroom CC, your files are automatically stored into the Adobe cloud. Yeah, so that's the major fundamental difference, I'd say, between Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC. And for example, Lightroom CC, you will pay by the month, but you will also pay by the terabyte used. And the basic plan is for 1 terabyte, per month per terabyte is $9.99 plus tax, and I think that will translate into 9.99 euros plus VAT as well. So major difference there, and if you're a high volume shooter, I think you'll probably want to stay a while with Lightroom Classic, because if, like me, you have 8 terabyte in the worth of images, well, then it would mean that if I want to switch to Lightroom CC, I'd have to get the 10 terabyte plan, which is $99.9 or euros per month. So that's maybe a little bit too expensive. But if you're somebody who doesn't shoot that much and who doesn't really need all that storage, then Lightroom CC might be an interesting alternative, because one of the main advantages is that it lets you connect from different devices, whether it's your iPad, your iPhone, or any computer which runs Lightroom CC, the application itself. It lets you work on your images in a very straightforward way. Contrary to Lightroom Classic, where if you want to work with multiple images, there's all kinds of loopholes. I mean, if you want to work with multiple computers, there's all kinds of loopholes that you have to jump through. Now, Again, this is not a course on Lightroom CC, but let's switch back to the other question that will probably interest a lot of Lightroom 6 users. Where is Lightroom 7? Well, I have bad news for you people, because Lightroom 7 as a standalone perpetual license won't be available anymore. In fact, Lightroom Classic CC, its full name is Lightroom Classic CC 7, but it's only available as a subscription. So this means that Lightroom 6 is the last version of Lightroom that is available as a perpetual license, which you pay once and then for which you don't need the subscription. Now, the thing is that if you're a Lightroom 6 user, well, basically you have two options, because Adobe have announced that they will continue to support Lightroom 6 until the end of this year, which isn't very long. This is the end of 2017, by the way, if you're watching this video in 2018 or later. So, new camera support will be added until the end of this year, and also operating system support will be added. But for example, come next year, if Mac or Windows do an operating system upgrade, which would break something in the way Lightroom 6 works with these operating systems, then there won't be any new updates. And the same goes with new cameras. But for the new camera part, the Adobe DNG converter will still be updated apparently, so you could still switch, or you could still convert. If you buy a new camera, you can still convert those images to DNG and then import them into Lightroom 6. But if, for example, you know, Windows 11 comes out, or Windows 12, or I don't know, or Mac OS Super High Sierra or whatever, and Lightroom doesn't play nicely anymore, Lightroom 6, well, then you're basically on your own. So at that point, there's no rush, I'd say, but you, as a Lightroom 6 user, or as a Lightroom 5 user, you'll have to either move to the cloud subscription, so the Lightroom Classic CC, which also involves Photoshop. You also get a subscription to Photoshop, by the way, which is, and the two of them together are $9.99 again. So that's your one option, and your other option basically is to, if you don't want to pay a subscription, is to let go of Lightroom altogether, basically. Now, personally, I think the subscription is a really good deal, and I've actually got a separate video which I will be uploading at some point in the future, which walks you through 10 reasons why, for me, as a Lightroom 6 user, you're doing a great deal by upgrading to the subscription plan Lightroom Classic CC. So that's for, first of all, the new name. Second of all, now, what's Lightroom CC? I would personally have preferred that Adobe kept the old name for the old product and gave the new product a new name, because this kind of confusing name switch will create a lot of confusion in when you search for training. If you're a user in 2018 of the new Lightroom CC and you will go Lightroom CC training, well, you'll find all stuff that isn't relevant to you, because it'll be about the old Lightroom, which is now Lightroom Classic. And the same thing, if you're looking for Lightroom Classic right now, you'll find very few tutorials, because most of the Lightroom Classic tutorials are still called Lightroom CC or Lightroom 6 tutorials. Anyway, don't shoot me, I'm only the messenger, obviously. Now, so the second thing we saw was, what about Lightroom CC? Quick introduction. Third thing we saw was, what about Lightroom 6? And now let's talk about the new features, because that's probably what you're most interested about. Well, the first new feature, and if I can call it a feature, some people will say, well, it's only obvious that this shouldn't be a feature. This should be by default in any application, but it's speed. In fact, the main priority of the Lightroom development team was speed. Bring the application back up to speed, so to say, because more and more photographers were, and I think rightfully so, complaining about the fact that Lightroom had become a bit of a slow program to use. And so the number one concern was to increase the speed. And that's been done on a number of levels. For example, you'll notice that Lightroom CC, Classic CC, starts up a lot quicker than it used to. So that's one nice thing. The other thing is that if you switch from library to develop, that's also become a lot quicker. And that's something that, I don't know about you, but I do that plenty of times a day, switching from a library to develop by pressing the G key to go to the grid view and then the D key to go back to develop. So that's, I won't say that you don't get the occasional spinning beach ball, but on average it's become faster. Another thing that's become faster in develop is the so-called develop walk. If you go from one image to another, well, it's really become a lot faster too. So that's another thing that I really appreciate. And these are small things, but you know, in a day, they really give you a lot of extra time. Another thing that's quicker now is painting with the paintbrush. That used to slow a lot of people down, and right now this is a GFX50S file, so it's a quite big file. And let me just quickly brush on here just to show you that it really works nicely. And I mean, it's not about creating the perfect mask here. So let me make another edit, and maybe I'll increase the clarity on the wall slightly. Yeah, so you can see no spinning beach balls, everything works really nicely. So big adjustment brush masks work quicker now, and that's also something that's really nice, I'd say. Finally, there's been other speed improvements in importing, exporting, and a couple of other places. Now, one quick general idea or tip about speed is that if you go into Lightroom's preferences and you go to the performance tab, you have these options here. Use graphics processor, and by default, if your graphics processor is supported, this is switched on. But there are rare occasions where using the graphics processor actually slows down Lightroom. So if you're experiencing trouble, and this isn't new in Lightroom Classic, by the way, this has been introduced, this option, I think in Lightroom 6 somewhere. So if you're experiencing problems, one thing to try is to switch off that checkbox here and see if things improve. Another thing that's a good idea in general, and again not limited to Lightroom Classic, is if your images are on a really slow hard drive, suppose a network drive or a USB 2 drive, or I don't know, or a memory stick for all I know, then making smart previews of your images and checking this here, use smart previews instead of originals for image editing, will also speed up your workflow considerably, because Lightroom will then work with these lower resolution, lower weight, so to speak, smart previews. Now, you can create smart previews upon import if you hit the, and we'll talk about import a lot more in a second, but you can put that here, build smart previews, and Lightroom will build these smart previews for you. And if you already have images, well, for which you don't have smart previews, you just go into your all photographs, you select them all, and you choose photo, or rather library, previews, build smart previews, and this will build all those smart previews for you maybe overnight. And the advantage is not only speed, but it's also, if your images are on an external drive and you have smart previews, then you will still be able to edit them on the go, even without that external drive being present. So it's a really great feature, and I talk a lot about that workflow in my Lightroom 6 and CC ebook, which is still 95% up to date, by the way, and the 5% that aren't up to date are addressed in this particular video. So feel free to give that book a read if you're interested. Now, so that was like, let's say, half of a new feature. There's nothing really new in there, but it's a good thing that Lightroom speed has improved. Now, as for a truly new feature, which I'm super excited about and which for me is probably worth updating if I weren't already subscribed to the subscription model, is the thing I'm going to show you now. And it is the way how Lightroom now works with embedded previews in your RAW files. Because here's the thing how it used to be, how it is still if you're a Lightroom 6 or a Lightroom CC 2015 user. And if you shoot a lot of images, like if you're a wedding photographer or a sports photographer or a journalist, you come back home with a memory card full of images, you want to go through them, see which ones are sharp and which ones aren't. And the thing that happens is that you have to wait until, because you want to zoom into one-on-one, and you have to wait until Lightroom has built its own one-on-one preview. And depending on your camera and your computer, that can take up to 10 seconds sometimes. Like for my GFX, and this is a really new iMac, it still takes up to 10 seconds. And then maybe I see that the image is soft anyway, so that's 10 seconds lost. And then I switch to the next one, I have to wait 10 seconds again. So it's not really a handy workflow. So a lot of high volume photographers that I know have actually switched to using an app like Photo Mechanic at the start of their Lightroom workflow to quickly go through their images and then import only the selection into Lightroom. And you can still do that, but what I'm going to show you now might make that it's not necessary to do that workflow anymore. Because up until now, the advice that I gave was, well, you just, when you import images, instead of waiting image per image to import, do this. Have Lightroom build one-on-one previews, go and have a cup of coffee, or maybe even a long lunch if it's a lot of images, and then start your editing process, your culling process, once Lightroom has finished building all these previews. Because then at least you don't have to wait 10 seconds if you switch from one image to the other, because Lightroom has pre-built them. But it still takes, if you have 1,000 images, it still might take 5,000 seconds, so that's a lot of time. So, and if you're on a deadline, you don't have that time to spare. And this is where this new workflow comes in. So I don't know if you know that, but even if you shoot only RAW, there's also a JPEG preview that's being generated when you press the shutter button. And actually that JPEG preview is also the one you see on the back of your LCD screen, by the way. So the thing is that Lightroom now allows you to use those embedded previews, as they are called, to judge the sharpness of your image, for example. So it no longer insists on building a one-on-one preview first, a very nice color-managed one-on-one preview first, to let you judge sharpness. So let me import, for example, these images here of a shot with a Nikon D800. And by the way, there's a difference on how this workflow works with mirrorless cameras, with most mirrorless cameras, as opposed to like in this case, a DSLR, digital DSLR. And I'll address that difference in a separate video in an upcoming blog post. Now, let's go to my previous import. So these icons here are the new icons that indicate that, I don't know if you noticed, but when I imported my images, I chose embedded and sidecar when I chose to build previews. So what this means is that Lightroom will now use the embedded JPEG preview, which in the case of a D800 is a full-size preview. It will show that instead. So I only have to double-click, and then again here, this is my loop view. I have this badge saying that I'm seeing an embedded preview, right? And now if I click to zoom, I immediately, in this case, see that this image isn't sharp. So I can switch to the next one, and as you can see now, this one is sharp. So, and I didn't have to wait 5 or 10 seconds for that one-on-one Lightroom build preview to show up. So that's the really nice thing about this workflow, that you can start culling your images, separating the wheat from the chaff a lot quicker and easier without having to resort to very long lunches or external applications before you can do so. So to me, this is a highlight feature, and if you are a high volume photographer, you really will be very happy with this. Again, there's some nuances as to how this goes, but I'll address those in a separate video. Okay, another new feature, so this is a library slash organizational new feature. There's also a very cool new feature in the develop part of things, and that's two new range masks that have been introduced. So these are ways to refine the selection that you have, a local adjustment that you have made either with the adjustment brush, the graduated filter, or the radial filter. So let me show you how that works. To me, they remind me a little bit of the way that control points work in Nik software, and I used to be, and I still am, a big fan of those. And I think it's very similar in a way, and it gives tremendous control. So, for example, in this image, I want to increase the smoke. I want to draw more attention to the smoke that comes out of this kettle here, or this plate, or whatever it is. And the problem is that this smoke is very, soft, it goes everywhere. It's very hard to select. I mean, a radial filter won't do it, a graduated filter certainly won't do it. So I could try and select it with the adjustment brush, and I could even try to use auto mask, but auto mask very often leaves very jagged edges. So the new feature is that you just use your adjustment brush, and by the way, I've got this small preset which is called Smoke Enhancer, so I'll just use that, and I will brush over the smoke very, roughly, and as you can see, it brings out, let me undo this here, it brings out the smoke really nicely, but it also had some collateral damage. For example, this side of the pot here is also affected, and the blacks behind the smoke are also becoming way too black, and that's because of the clarity and the dehaze settings here. But it's very hard for me to just brush on the smoke itself, and that's where the next feature comes in super handy, because this smoke has obviously a very different brightness level than the background that I photographed it against. And so I now have a choice of either of this range mask, which will refine the selection that I made within the confines of what I brushed. So it's a further refinement of an initial selection that you made with the adjustment brush, the radial filter, or the graduated filter. So if I switch this to luminance, what I can do now is, by default, it has selected the entire luminance range of my initial selection. So let me maybe press the O key so that you see this is where I brushed initially. Yeah? And now by bringing in that range slider from the blacks, from the darkest point, I'm actually telling Lightroom to exclude from my original mask, to exclude the darkest parts. And the more I drag this up, the more it will exclude. As you can see, it will focus within that original brush selection, it will focus on the highlights. And I can even do the same from the other direction. And as you can see now, bringing this in allows me to touch up this a little bit better. And again, the idea is not to make this a perfect selection. I don't need to cut this smoke out and paste it into something else. For that, I'd probably need Photoshop. But the idea is to give me a really good selection in as little time as possible, and that I don't have the most annoying side effects, right? And then I have this smoothness slider, which allows me to, if I drag it to the left, to make the selection even more precise, but at the cost of having some jaggies here and there, or make it a little bit more soft. And again, I'm now working in this mask view, but I would probably just work in regular view and see which setting makes it more believable, which setting blends it better with the background. And to me, that's something like this. Again, this is before the adjustment brush, this is after the adjustment brush. So I've really managed to target my adjustments only onto the smoke. And instead of painting a very precise selection, I painted the rough selection and then let my luminance range mask, as it's called, do the hard work. So again, this is, to me, this is a feature that, it's not something super exciting, maybe like faces that were introduced in Lightroom, I think 6, or some of the other like HDR or whatever. But this is actually a feature that probably I will be using on half of my images and on probably all of my images that I do local adjustments on. So it may look like a small feature, but to me it's actually a big deal, and it will save me lots of time, and it will allow me to make some better edits. Now, one thing you have to bear in mind is that this new feature also makes it necessary that there is a new process version. So we now have, if we look at the settings, we now have the new process version 4. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. The reason I'm telling you this is that if you would apply a preset on here that has process version 3 hard-coded into the settings, then appearances might look different. So that's just something to bear in mind. Okay, now there's another feature as well, or another range mask, and that is this one here, the color range mask. So for example, suppose I want to soften the skin of this model. Well, what I could do is, and I would definitely have to use a different setting like soften skin, for example. So I can use again a very big brush, rough brush, and I could also use the radial filter, by the way. In fact, let's do that. Let's use the radial filter to show you that this technique also works with the radial filter. So let's invert our radial filter so that we focus on the inside of my selection. So it has softened the skin, but the problem is that if you look at the eyes, this is before and after. It has also softened the eyes and the lips, which wasn't actually the idea. So again, I could use the brush inside of my radial filter and paint out the eyes of the mask, but that's a lot of work. It would probably be easier just to use my range mask, set it to color, and then say to Lightroom, well, you know, this color, for example, I want you to, within that broad oval elliptical selection, I want you to only maintain this color, and I can shift click on another color and maybe shift click here, and even I can shift click and drag to include a range of colors. So, but this allows me to tweak my mask. So in this case, the other mask was luminance based, this one is color based. And again, if I do a before and after, you see that the eyes now remain much sharper because the mask that I created is only affecting, or more is affecting the pink skin tones more than it is affecting the rest. And again, I have a mount slider to soften or tweak my mask even more. So that's another, I think, really nice feature to have in this update. And these are also the two main features. So it's not like there's this whole list of new features. And this is also the reason why my Lightroom book is still very much up to date, because apart from the speed, these are the two main new features. Now, there's also one or two other smaller features that I'll quickly run by you. First one has to do with in the collections. You now have a couple of extra smart collection criteria. For example, in the other metadata option, you have one that now also allows you to search for empty title fields, but that's something very specific, I would say. Another thing that's somewhat important, I think, is when you export now, there used to be an option, all metadata or all except camera and camera raw. So there was no way to export just the lens metadata, for example, and the camera metadata, but not your processing metadata. And this new setting here, all except camera raw info, lets you do just that. So it will let you export into your images metadata which lens you shot the image with, but it won't export your edits, like a preset, for example, that you applied. Yeah? So smaller thing, but still good to know. So that's it, a really quick roundup of all the new stuff that you should know as a Lightroom CC user. I think, well, it's a no-brainer. You're already on the subscription, so the main thing for you will be having to deal with the name change to Lightroom Classic, and also getting to know the new features which I talked about, and hopefully enjoying the speed increase. As a Lightroom 6 user, well, you now have an idea of what is in Lightroom Classic, and you also know that you'll, in the end, sooner or later, if you want to stick with Lightroom, you'll have to switch to a subscription model. And so that's it. I will also, as I said, I will, in the weeks to come, I will give you more examples of these new features, and I will also get back to you on that import embedded preview workflow, because as I mentioned, there's a little bit more to it, especially if you're shooting with the mirrorless cameras, but that's for another video. Thank you for watching for now. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter if you want to stay updated on Lightroom tips. Each newsletter I send out always has a Lightroom or a Flash or a Photoshop tip, and you'll also be the first to hear about new videos such as this one. Thanks for watching, and talk to you later. Bye-bye.